so soon. It also shares the same title, Envisioning a Sustainable Tropics. The conference and lecture series have been organized by the students and faculty of the TCD program, and the goal is to really stimulate a dynamic interchange about the issues and complexity of sustainability and environmental and human well-being. This year's lecture series will bring experts working on sustainability issues from around the world and also highlight the work and activities of faculty here on the UF campus. The lectures are scheduled through the duration of the semester, and they'll be happening every Thursday at 10:40 to 11:40 like today. I think there is one exception. I can't remember. I think it's in 2 weeks where it's actually happening at 1:40. Is that
12:40.
Okay. But anyways, just check the schedule. But usually they will be Thursdays at 10:40. They will also be followed by an informal discussion with our speakers downstairs in 376 Grinter. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Betty Loisel, the director of the TCD program, who will introduce our speaker today.
Great, thanks, Phil. And thanks everyone for coming. It's a packed house. I encourage those people that are actually out in the hall, maybe you could find some floor space inside, and we won't tell the Center for African Studies we're probably violating every single fire rule there is on this campus. So be kind if we need to leave the room quickly, and don't stomp on them as they go through. I think Dr. Altieri really needs very little introduction. He, of course, is world famous. He has helped really establish agroecology as an emerging discipline to provide the basic ecological principles and mechanisms to understand how to manage sustainable agroecosystems. His work has contributed to improving biocontrol of pests in agricultural fields through intercropping, weed management, and vegetative management at the border of crop fields. His work has also demonstrated that when biological diversity is enhanced in agriculture, year-round food security for small farmers can be achieved, and the reliance on chemical inputs is reduced. Some of you may not realize that Dr. Altieri is a Gator. He got his PhD here, and I'm actually sitting next to one of his committee members, Dr. Jack Ewell. So we welcome him back to the University of Florida. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Altieri. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel like in my qualifiers now here. Jack Ewell, from whom I learned a lot actually about some of the principles that I'm going to be talking about. And I graduated here in 1979 as an entomologist, and that's how my career started in agroecology. Because entomologists really were the first ones that were confronted to industrial agriculture, pesticides use, and many of them were prompted to look for alternatives to pesticides. And many of the strategies to enhance biological control of insects is diversity in agroecosystems. And well, sure enough, traditional farmers were doing that for centuries in the tropics, and so we learned from them. So my affiliation is the University of California. I'm a professor there, but also I'm a member of the Sociedad Científica Latinoamericana de Agroecología. Clara Nichols, my wife, she's also an entomologist from Davis, and she's the president of the society. She's also a professor of the University of Antioquia in Colombia, where we have a PhD, a Latin American PhD program with about 60 students from 8 countries. And so basically, very quickly, I like to kind of go a little bit through the history of agricultural development in Latin America and where agroecology fits, and then kind of provide a perspective of what I call the agroecological revolution going on there. So the first assumptions of hunger, and I'm not going to go into the details, have to do with a very Malthusian view of the world, where populations are expanding, and therefore there's a gap between food production and human population growth, and then we need to close the gap. The way to close the gap is by bringing technologies from the north. At that time, the Green Revolution, the most prominent one, obviously biotechnology. So at that time, what happened is they created the centers. There was the CGIAR, which established CIMID and CIAD and CIP in Latin America. These centers were centers that were basically established to improve varieties, which would be accompanied by mostly fertilizers and irrigation. As you can see here in CIMID in Colombia, in Mexico, there's a little town behind it. These are the systems that the researchers were establishing, monocultures of wheat and maize and so on. And behind that, you had the traditional farmers doing their practices. Obviously, there was no correspondence between what the scientists were doing and what the traditional farmers were doing. As a matter of fact, very near there, in Mesquite, about 40 kilometers from Cime, you have the Chinampas systems, which still exist in some parts of near Mexico City. And at that time, the maize yields in the Chinampas were they reached about 6.3 tons, whereas the US yields at that time were about 2.3, and then after that they reached about 4 tons. So the question was, who's going to come and teach to grow corn to whom? And in addition to that, it turns out that these Chinampas, which were very enriched systems with many other plants and fish and ducks and so on, could produce enough food for 15 to 20 persons per hectare. But the centers were established anyway, and you can see this is SEAT, where in this type of conditions, optimal conditions, flat soils, access to irrigation and fertilizers and so on, they developed the varieties of wheat, maize, beans, cassava, etc. And the idea was that these varieties would work in these environments, which is where most of the small farmers are, marginal environments, no access to technology, capital, etc. No rainfall, no irrigation, it's all based on rain-fed systems. And there's no wonder then that if you just look at, for example, what happened in Mexico, is that the small farmers did not benefit from the Green Revolution. Actually, the more entrepreneurial farmers, the ones that were rich in capital, in good land resources and so on, benefited. So, peasants were bypassed by the agricultural modernization in Latin America. And it happened also in other countries, in other continents too. It's interesting because there was a scientist in Berkeley, a geographer called Sauer, who warned about this. If you read some of the writings that some anthropologists have been doing lately about the Green Revolution, he said, hey, you guys, don't bring your Iowa and Ohio maize into the tropics, because this is what's going to happen. You are going to upset the cultural systems and the agroecological systems. Then the Green Revolution was criticized for several things, but one of them was that maize and beans really are not commercial crops. What you need to do is integrate the peasants into the world economy and then make them competitive. So that's when started what is called the non-traditional agro-export crops program in Central America, sponsored by AID, where, for example, in Costa Rica, farmers would, instead of growing corn and beans, why don't you grow pineapples, strawberries, melons, macadamia nuts, flowers, etc. And then you can see that what happened immediately, this is the cost of production of corn and beans, this is the cost of production of the traditional export crops, much of that into chemicals. They went into in what we call the pesticide treadmill. Production failed, just like it did with cotton in other parts of Latin America. Then comes the next wave, which is the actual wave, is that biotechnology, transgenic crops, are going to the ones that are going to feed the world. And without getting too much into the discussion of transgenics, because that could be, open a Pandora box, but we can argue, we can discuss if you want, is that actually there are two major crops that could be considered edible, which is maize and soybean, but it turns out that half of that goes to feed cattle and the other half goes to feed cars. So there's not 1 hectare of the 180 million hectares of transgenic crops that is feeding one of the 1 billion people that are poor, that are hungry today. So this is what happens when you start growing soybean monocultures. This is in Bolivia at the expense of the natural forest. This is in southern Brazil. And basically there is a huge advance of the agricultural frontier. Many times this process is happening through what is called the land grabbing process. And you can see that the expansion in Argentina is very high in terms of area and production. The entry point is what is called the no-till agricultural systems, basically where you just start growing a monoculture of corn or wheat or barley, whatever, and then you spray, and you can grow the soybean the way you see it there. And then farmers are basically forced into a system where you have the no-till, the transgenic soybean, the glyphosate, and then the machinery that you need, because you need to be very efficient. So it turns out that you can see that in Argentina the number of farmers went down. About 50,000 farmers were displaced in a period of 6 years from 2000 to 2006, and then hectares went up. So there's a concentration of land because this creates an economy of scale. What happens is that you need 500 hectares minimum in order for you to grow afford the machinery that is going to make you competitive. And then obviously the use of this herbicide is causing all kinds of environmental problems, but one of the big ones is obviously weed resistance. And we have about 21 species already reported in Brazil and Argentina that are resistant to glyphosate. So as these monocultures expand, This is in Paraguay. This is a little island of small farmers. These are the only ones that produce food in a radius of 300 kilometers. So even the people that work for these corporations buy food from these peasants because they have nowhere else to go. So based on this critique of the Green Revolution comes the agroecological approach that says, well, food must be produced where the poor live, and using what is there. What is there? The seeds, the local knowledge, the local resources. And very quickly, it was understood in Latin America that farmers have small farmers have a tremendous role to play. Custodians of agrobiodiversity, they keep about 1.9 million varieties, all the peasants of the world, in their hands. The Green Revolution only produced 8,000 varieties. So they are repositories of indigenous knowledge, and etc. And their role, sorry some of these are in Spanish, but we're in the Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos. In Chile, for example, 51% of the vegetables and 40% of the extensive crops are produced by small farmers. In Ecuador, similar, controlling 3% of the land. A lot of the food is produced there. Cuba, which I'm going to go into in detail into that. And then Brazil, interestingly enough, they control 24% of the arable land. There are 4.8 family farmers. The government recognized the role of these people very soon and created what is called the Ministerio de Desenvolvimiento Agrario, the small-scale minister, which recognizes that these farmers play a key role and that they need to be protected by the government. So these farmers, some of them, they're still repositories of traditional systems. If you go to the Andes, Mesoamerica, and so on. And basically, this is a scheme of the knowledge that they have. This is by Victor Manuel Toledo, a very famous Mexican anthropologist, ecology. And you see that they have knowledge about soils, plants, landscape units, microclimate, and so on. We know the examples of the Andes, where farmers were confronted with this tremendous vertical changes of temperature and humidity and soil conditions, and created the systems that are the agroecological belts with a very rich level of biodiversity, about 60 varieties of potatoes sometimes you find in one terrace. So the idea is then how to combine this corpus of practice, this knowledge and theory and practice that these farmers have, and integrate, create a dialogue of wisdoms to allow these farmers to better adapt to the changing conditions, because things are changing. The economic system is changing, technologies are getting in, climate change is changing, and so on. So there's been a lot of efforts going on by NGOs, which are the ones that started the agroecological revolution in Latin America. For example, these are examples from the 90s, early 90s, in Cajamarca region, where restoring some of these terraces, using some green manures, such as some legumes from the region, and you can see that they are restoring about 35% of that land under this management. And the advantages, if you look at the non-terrace versus the terrace, the percent increase in production just by changing the microclimatic and soil conditions increases tremendously. About near Puno, about 3,800 meters above sea level, this system existed. The archaeological record shows the existence of Chinampas. I'm sorry, not Chinampas, Waru-warus. And these systems have been restored in many areas near Puno, because they provide tremendous advantages when you have frost. The water, keeps the warmth during the day, absorbs it, and in the night releases it, changes the microclimate in 1 or 2 degrees. And today, there's about 4,720 hectares already recovered, all by efforts of NGOs with local communities. In the south of Chile and Chiloé Island, the Huilliche Indians, especially the women, played a key role in maintaining the land races of potatoes, because this is a secondary center of origin of potatoes. We did some work with an NGO called SET, and here you can see some of the varieties that these women kept. Actually, many of the genes of these varieties saved Europe when after the famine of Ireland, because actually this woman, who already died unfortunately, she said that she knew some Russian botanists that came to collect from the Babylon school some potatoes. And then what happens is that very soon we recognize the role of these women in the preservation, so they started training other farmers that had lost genetic diversity. They established seed banks. This is the traditional method of growing potatoes, no-till system. Each one of these lines is a traditional variety that was discovered, and then the farmers and their families would come and collect the potatoes that they liked. They would reintroduce them in their communities, and the seed bank was continued that way. There are many efforts that are similar to that. For example, in Oaxaca, Mexico, in the Mixteca, there is a maize. The weather is changing dramatically. But there are some farmers that still keep this maize called the maíz de cajete, which is a system, is a variety that actually is planted deep in the soil. So you need the knowledge of farmers. And then it can germinate without water, because there is enough hygroscopic water in the soil to allow for germination. But this is a technique for climate change. None of the new varieties can perform without rain in that area, only the maíz de cajete. And the way the farmers maintain this, in addition to having in situ conservation, they have seed fairs all over. If you go to many towns in many parts of Latin America, where farmers come, show their varieties, and then they exchange varieties, and then next year, you know, they try them again, and they talk again. So this is a way in which the seed diversity is maintained, but at the same time, in order to maintain the seed diversity, you need to have the cultural diversity. So agroecology then is basically a science that uses some of the elements that we learn in the Western university, but also traditional farmers' knowledge, and then we create a dialogue of wisdom that derives in principles, and not in technologies or recommendations, but principles that take technological forms. But in order for those forms to be relevant to farmers, there has to be a process of participation of the farmers in the research agenda. So agroecology really has several characteristics. One of them is that it's non-neutral and is self-reflexive. So basically, it gives rise to a critique of the conventional agricultural paradigm. It recognizes the values of local wisdom and traditions, creating a dialogue, adopts a long-term vision, and then is a science that carries an ecological and social ethics, interested in social justice, economic viability, as well as cultural preservation. So what NGOs started doing then, saying is that, well, the way the technologies for them to be really suitable for farmers, they have to be born from this participatory process, but they have to be based on indigenous knowledge, on the local resources, on cultural traditions, and they have to also enhance total farm productivity and not just the productivity of one particular crop. And there's a whole array of efforts that went on and still go on in some countries, especially in the Andean regions, in the Central American regions, in the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, where, for example, one of the big challenges was, well, these are land class 4, 5, 6 soils that should not be used for agriculture, but they are the farmers. Nobody's going to do a land reform, so what do we do to help these farmers in these conditions? So there were many, many efforts in soil conservation practices with diversified farming systems. This is an example from Dominican Republic. Here you can see a model farm that was developed and then replicated among farmers in a collective manner. Here you can see the start of a system and the end of a system. Then there were many efforts in Central America with Vecinos Mundiales, world neighbors, promoting mucuna, which is a very aggressive legume that they could use for cover crop, but also for as a mulch to control erosion and so on. And there were some very interesting examples showing that there were increases in yields from 400 to 2,000 or 2,500 kilos under those conditions in the highlands of Central America. Some other NGOs, like for example Sedicam, which is a peasant NGO in Mexico, in the Mixteca, recovered the land in this very degraded environments in Mixteca because of failed projects of excessive forest cutting and excessive grazing and so on, and they decided to stay. So you see these little islands of recovered systems. Because what is the future of these peasants? To migrate to California, and they wanted to stay there. So they started a program of reforestation with a pinus that is from Oaxacensis in the top of the mountain, because they understand the role that the forest cover can play in the hydrological cycle. All kinds of efforts for soil conservation as well as water harvesting. Because it turns out that it rains there, but only 2 months a year, and then you have 10 others that, where there's no rain. So water harvesting plays a key role, and then depending on the amount of water that they harvest, they are able to water their plants where they have reintroduced amaranthus along with corn. So that changes. Efforts like this of landscape restoration among farmers is very common. This is in Tobio, in Colombia, in the Cauca Valley. You can see how they started recovering the forest but the idea was to create these systems where you have agriculture and forest edges, because there is an effort of conservation and production, and many times this natural vegetation can play key ecological roles within the agroecosystems. Well, the other example that is very important is Cuba, and as you know, there was a 1990 when the Soviet bloc collapsed. You can see the tremendous drop in the imports of pesticides, fertilizers, petroleum, and you know, it's very easy to kind of imagine what would happen in Florida if tomorrow we turn off the pesticides, fertilizers, and petroleum. You know, the whole thing collapses. Well, there was a period of adaptation in Cuba, but it turns out that many farmers, especially ANAP, which is the National Association of Small Farmers, started adopting agroecological techniques, because there were a lot of scientists that were involved in this kind of research, but they were kind of the minority at that time. But then when the collapse happened and the special period came, they became, you know, the most important scientists that had something to offer the country under these circumstances. I need to point out that Cuba has 2% of the Latin American population, but 11% of the scientists, because of the role of the revolution in education, which is something we hope is not going to be lost with this new process that might be starting in Cuba. This is the most sophisticated machinery you're going to find among these small farmers. Tremendous amount of innovation with what they call natural fertilizers. For example, they have a thing called té de montaña, which is basically based on the litter of forest. And then with that, they inoculate their preparations, and they are rich in microorganisms, including mycorrhiza and many antagonists. This is one of the farmers that Casimiro and his family in Santi Spiritu, where they have 10 hectares. You can see that they put a lot of multiple purpose trees as hedgerows. That's very important for hurricane resistance. And then they have pastures and crops that are alternating, and a lot of fruit trees. We did a study with a colleague called Fernando Funes in Cuba. You can see that this family can produce 34, he can feed with protein 34 people with the production of 1 hectare. That's a hell of a lot of productivity. And the energy efficiency of this system is about 30. That means they put 1 kilocalorie and they recovered 30. And the way they started spreading is through what is called the Campesino, which is a vertical, horizontal method of exchange of information between farmers, which started actually in Central America. You see that right after the special period there were 216 families, 120 now today. And with these systems, you can see this is the contribution of the peasant sector before the special period, that is when there were no pesticides, and after. So immediately when you don't have petroleum, who are the ones that are going to respond? The peasants. And so the Campesino movement really played a key role in Latin America in spreading agroecology, because there are no universities, there's no extension services, there's no research centers that are devoted to agroecology. 90% are green revolution. So you have to have an alternative, and the alternative is something that the farmers create by themselves. So our role here is basically a facilitating role in this whole process. Well, Brazil is a very interesting country, because in Brazil they have a new law now, a national law of agroecology. They have a Ministry of Agriculture devoted only to small farmers, and they have within the new law they have a program where they ensure that 30% of the production of small farmers is bought by the government and then devoted for the social market, that is the institutional market, the schools, the hospitals, and so on. So in Brazil, if you go to South Brazil, Paraná, Santa Catarina, etc., you'll find a lot of small farmers that are involved in this process. Here you can see these farmers are selling their organic produce much cheaper, actually cheaper than conventional, because there is an agreement with the municipality. And then there are programs in which they need to have also preparation of the food, processing of the food, because they are involved in this program that much of this food goes to the schools. So you're not going to give just tomatoes and lettuce to the kids. You have to give them ham and eggs and yogurt and so on, and cheese. So here you can see the meriendas. These are going all to schools, and these farmers have about 40,000 meriendas per week that they have to produce. So they have to become very organized. The quality has to be high, etc., etc. And then there's a huge network in Southern Brazil called REDE de Agroecologia, which is basically a network of agricultural families, cooperatives, organized consumers, NGOs, and so on, and the municipality supporting this process, in which there is kind of a certification process that allows for kind of a participatory or solidario certification, and there is no foreign companies coming to certify the product. So you can see that in Brazil, with the support of the government, with the NGOs and the social movement, there's a huge concentration. All this yellow is basically agroecological projects, and there's very little in the Northwest yet, but it's emerging. But then, what happens is that the peasant organizations take the agroecological concept as part of the food sovereignty. So the Via Campesina, which is the largest peasant movement, basically created the concept of food sovereignty, which agroecology is one of the big pillars. So you have land reform, obviously, and access to water, seeds. Social movements pushing the government so that the governments have to respond to the request of farmers, and that's what is called the agroecological, the food sovereignty agenda. So social movements are key to achieving supported policy environments, and the combination of peasant and family farming with agroecology can feed families, and upscaling really requires social movements at the center who can build alliances with the government and so on. So why Via Campesina is adopted agroecology? Again, this is Spanish, but it's a very important component of food sovereignty. And then it's very important to create what they call a culture of resistance, lucha, struggle, and autonomy, which is necessary to survive in the recurring crises that are going on in the area. So agroecology is compatible with the social movement because it's socially activating. You require participation of the people. It's economically viable because it doesn't create dependence. It's based on local resources, respects and mobilizes traditional knowledge, as opposed to the Green Revolution that basically thought that the peasants were ignorant. No, here we see them as a source of knowledge and skills. Optimizes and revitalizes the small farm rather than changing it, optimizing it, and provides the principles to reach food sovereignty. So one of the biggest members of the Via Campesina is the MST, the Landless Peasant Movement, which already is about 1 million families that already have 10 million hectares in their hands. Because in Brazil, like in Venezuela and other countries, there is a concept of the social function of the land. So if the land that is in the hands of the latifundio is not producing, you can expropriate it. So what they do, they occupy the land and then the government is forced to expropriate. And here, in this farms, the farmers start recovering the soil, producing vegetables, opening markets, and then they even have now a seed producing company because they saw the need to produce their own varieties, open pollinated varieties for agroecological systems. So the response of peasant movements to aggressions by corporate interest is that peasants, including women, rural women, and landless, are increasing agroecological diversification of their farming system as a tool in the defense and reconfiguration and transformation of contested territories. So basically what we're seeing is that this concept of the territory now, these are not small plots that are isolated where a bunch of farmers located in a region, but rather territories become reserves of biodiversity, reserves of food sovereignty and so on, and they're basically a response to these pressures that are attempting against their livelihoods. Latifundia, monocultures, biofuels, monocultures, etc., plantations, etc. So basically, as what's his name? Van der Ploeg, who is a sociologist in Netherlands, who wrote a wonderful book recently about the revival of the peasantry in Latin America. He says that the food empires are basically the big multinationals that are controlling what the farmers are going to use as technology, for whom they're going to produce, how much they're going to produce, etc. And the consumers also are victims because these guys are vertically stratified. So all this, the Publixes or the Walmarts are determining what are you going to eat, what's the quality of your food, how much you're going to pay for it. So basically they control the food system, and what the Via Campesina envisions is that you can create a bypass by creating autonomous territories, opening local markets using agroecology. You can create a bypass to what they call the dominated agro-food system by the corporations. So just to start finishing here, we have several innovation poles in Latin America: Cuba, Central America, Mexico, Brazil, the Andean region. The agroecological revolution is not being led by universities or research centers or governments. It's by the Via Campesina, associated with NGOs like that are organized in Maela, and then SOCLA, which is a Latin American society of about 800 scientists from all over Latin America, professors, researchers in universities, that has been in existence since 2007. We have our 5th Congress happening in Argentina in October. And you can see that agroecology then conforms a phenomena where the changes of paradigms, technological and scientific changes of paradigms, are acting and are built in constant reciprocity with the social movements and the political processes, giving then rise to a transformation of the systems. And this is being supported now by laws that were created by the pressure of the social movements on the government. So you have legal initiatives in Latin America that are a discourse, but that at least provide a legal framework for implementation to happen. So Ecuador, Bolivia, Guatemala, Brazil, Venezuela, Nicaragua, they all have instruments in which food sovereignty, even prohibition of transgenic crops, like in Bolivia, in Peru. I just was in Belize also. They don't allow the introduction of this technology. And it provides, therefore, a legal framework that gives constitutional rights for the implementation of agriculture. Well, I think I'm going to finish there, and hopefully there is time for a few questions.
We certainly do have time for questions. Anybody want to start out? Emilio?
First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much. That was just phenomenal. I not only learned a lot, but I think I'll leave here inspired and motivated. And having said that, I was once told by someone that an optimist is just a pessimist with bad data. And so I'm wondering if there are any downsides potentially or shortcomings we should be aware of, because this is incredibly optimistic and inspiring, but at the same time, is there a but or something we should worry about or something we need to work on? I'll give only one example in my own experience. Is that I think as a biologist who works in Brazil, the MST is something that a lot of people support in terms of its spirit and in terms of its motivation and goals, but probably a lot of biologists get really worried when the MST invades a farm near the protected areas where they work, because people are going to start hunting there, or people are going to start cutting down the timber, or in our case, set it on fire. So there's one example of a reservation I have. Are there any other things we should be aware of?
Well, definitely. I mean, you see, the leadership of the Via Campesina adopted agroecology as a discourse, but now has to be implemented. And there are many, many organizations, including the MST, in which the farmers are still using monocultures, even transgenic crops in many of the settlements of the Via Campesina. They probably hunt and so on, yeah. But the idea is that through the schools that they're creating what they call the IALAs, Institutos Agroecológicos Latinoamericanos in different countries. They are going to be training these farmers, their children, on agroecology. So it's a slow process, but at least they're going to change those systems. You know, you have to give a transition period. Because why are they doing that? Because it turns out that the universities, the centers of research from the government, are not giving the responses. So they have to create their own universities. They are creating universities, 5-year degrees in agroecology. Okay. Well, that without resources, without many resource people that are interested in supporting that, it's difficult. It's going to be slow, but at least they're going to change. Whereas those biotechnology companies and those biofuel companies are going to go there, they're there just for destruction. They're not going to change those systems. So at least I see hope in that those settlements, as they get trained, as they see more demonstration farms that are changing, then possibly they're going to change. And I would like to say this afternoon I'm going to give a talk on more agronomic talk, and I'm going to show large-scale systems in Argentina and in Colombia and in other countries where agroecology principles are being used, and that those could become models for large-scale settlement like the ones the MST has. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Really compelling argument. I'm totally convinced. I'm convinced of your ruthless critique of agriculture, modern expansion, and this alternative. And I've seen a lot of people, I know people that have been inspired by you, these communities have shown, and yet you say still, after 30 years of this movement, 90% of the universities and extension agencies are not on the team. And so I wonder if you can identify some of the factors or forces that make other people not so convinced as you.
Well, first of all, there's a long colonization process, at least if we talk about Latin American universities. You know, when I went to California as a professor in 1981, I realized that when I studied in Chile, I learned California agriculture. Because all my professors had studied in Davis through the Ford Foundation program of Chile, California agriculture. They never mentioned peasants. Those indigenous women in Chiloé were not in the radar at all. Okay? So, you know, we need to have a new cadre of professionals, and it's a slow process. We have the only agroecology PhD in Latin America is the one in the University of Antioquia, which Clara coordinates. It's the only one, and we have 80 students, you know, from 8 countries. This is a very slow process. I remember when I was studying here, all the students that were here from Brazil were studying soybean with big scholarships. I remember they had, you know, nice cars and everything. What's the name of that village over there that was kind of the fancy one? Outside 34th South. Right, anyway. The poor ones were in Corey Village or something. And then, if you look at my university, University of California. University of California, Berkeley, has $500 million from BP, British Petroleum, to produce transgenic biofuels, okay? And the ones that do agroecology, obviously, were at total disadvantage in relation to even the use of resources. Now we have to pay for using the agricultural experiment station. Guess who gets all the agricultural experiment station? You know, to do the research. So there's a lot of impediments that are happening at that level that doesn't allow, despite the student interest, to flourish. I would invite you to see a movie that is actually in the movies called Occupy the Farm, which is talks about a little piece of land. We have 5 acres of land, prime agricultural land, that the university, which is an agricultural experiment station, Berkeley is a land-grant university, wants to sell for development. Well, guess what? Some community members and some former students of mine took over the land, and that movie is about that, to try to pressure the university to preserve the land for what? For training people in urban agriculture, which is going to become more and more important in the future. Remember that cities of 10 million people have to import 6,000 tons of food per day. And the average mileage, food miles, is about 1,000 miles. Think about the implications of that in terms of energy, greenhouse emissions, and the dependence and the fragility of the food systems of cities. Whereas if we use the models of Cuba, which I didn't show this time, but I'll show this afternoon, where they have 50,000 hectares of urban agriculture, producing 20 kilos per square meter of food per year. And I teach a class called Urban Agriculture, and I hope that my students can reach 5 kilos per square meter. You know, I challenge them. If you pass this course, if your garden you're going to set up at least has 5 kilos. That's 1/4 of what the Cubans get. So there's a lot of things that could be done, but are not done because of the political pressures, but more than that, the corporate pressures with big monies that start influencing the public research agenda. As far as I know, I'm an employee of the public University of California, not the private University of California. But many people have forgotten that, even the people from the land-grant system. And the other thing that is happening is that the positions of of applied ecology, applied agriculture, like the biocontrol. I was in the division of biocontrol, which was closed in 1995. I'm the last Mohican. Yeah, when I retire, which is probably soon, there's no biocontrol specialist left at the University of California. They're not going to replace my position with an agroecologist. Guess what they're going to hire? A gene jockey, with all respect. But that's what they're going to hire. People that can serve the interest of the corporate agenda that is going to continue funding the university. And the argument of the university is that we're not getting too much support anymore from the state, so we have to go for private monies. Yeah.
So related to that question, I guess, one of the things we always hear about organic and sustainable agriculture is that it cannot feed the world, that it's not able to scale up. And so there's always this push to scale up all these technologies, these social systems and everything. And so I saw in your presentation that whole idea of sort of territorial approaches to kind of organizing is one way to do that. But I'm wondering, just after this discussion about BP and these large corporate pressures, what are your thoughts on companies like Walmart doing organic? Or, what is the opportunity of scaling up through the corporate framework? Or is it just ideologically impossible?
That's a good point, because first of all, we need to distinguish between organic and agroecology.
Right. Yes.
Okay? So organic is basically what we call input substitution. You just change these chemicals for this other bunch of other chemicals that are kind of botanical or microbial, and then basically you are into the market, especially export market or the high-end markets that are going to be able to pay the older price. Okay, so what Walmart is doing is, because of the economies of scale that they can deploy, they are taking advantage of that situation. Actually, in California, 3% of the organic farmers control 80% of the market. Whereas the ones that started the process, the revolution at that time, were the hippies, the small-scale organic farmers. What happened to those guys? They're out. They are the big ones, so it became corporate. So, yeah, you can have organic cheaper by Walmart and maybe buy it in China or whatever. But is that going to lead to food sovereignty? Is that going to lead to the approaches that the vision of food sovereignty that Via Campesina does have? No. So definitely we have a clash of paradigms. You see, this whole thing is ideological, really. I tell my students the first day of my class, you're not going to get a neutral class here. You want to get neutral class, go and take, biotechnology 101. I have a vision. I'm from Chile. I cannot see my science separate from my political views of the world. I don't see who can, but some people claim they can. Some people say, no, I'm neutral, I'm not influenced by anything. So it is a vision of the world. How do you want to see the world in the future? And how do you want to see, are we really going to come up with a new paradigm? Because as Einstein said, you cannot solve the problems with the same mentality that created them. So if we understand this crisis, the ecological crisis of the world, climate change crisis, as the result of a model, a capitalist model controlled by big corporations, we cannot expect that those corporations are going to give us a response to the change. What they're going to do is they're going to green a little bit the thing, but they're going to perpetuate and postpone the problem.
I think we're going to take one more question, and I'm just going to remind everybody that we're going to have an opportunity to have a more informal discussion with Dr. Altieri down one floor in 376 Grinter Hall with some reception to follow this talk. So if you don't get your question in, come downstairs, grab something to eat. This talk has made me hungry too. Grab something to eat. And then I'll also remind you that he'll be talking this afternoon at 4:05 as a departmental seminar in agronomy, and I can't remember the room. Does anybody know the room?
G186.
G186. McCarty A. Okay, so let me just take one last question.
So I wanted to point out that, corporations giving money to universities has helped fill in vital gaps. So as states have given less money, people don't have money to do research and fund students. So, give them credit where credit is due. And having less people involved in agriculture with modernity is normal. And a lot of people look at that as societal progress, not a bad thing. And the other thing is, with all these automobiles, my car needs to eat too. And I think for a lot of people, if you ask them, hey, would you rather walk 12 miles to work or bike, and allow those resources that are going to feed your car to feed somebody on the other side of the world or on the other side of town, a lot of people would say, no, I want my car to eat. And so it's important to recognize that people are kind of selfish. I'm a capitalist, and a lot of this seems sort of socialist to me, and I'm okay with that. But I just want to point out that for a lot of people, they don't want to be farming. They like to watch TV, and they like junk food. And so I wonder if it may, I just want to point out before I sound too negative, it was reading your work that got me interested in agriculture. I'm a big supporter of a lot of the ideas you're espousing, but I'm pragmatic, and so I recognize like these multinational, vertically integrated food companies, they're not going to retreat peacefully. They're in it to win it. And so you just said yourself, when you retire, you'll be replaced with a gene jockey. So isn't it just sort of like fighting against the tide? Isn't this what's coming, is these more modern food systems? And then finally, I just want to say, as a question, can they both exist? Can there be a society around the world where there's people who want to eat healthy, sustainably produced foods, and people who want to watch TV and eat Twinkies, and that's okay?
That's a long question. In California, we will respond that with a bottle of wine. Hang out, and then. But no, I respect your views. I mean, you have as you say, a pragmatic view of the world. That's what's going on. But the point is that is driving us to disaster. So just think about the public health crisis of this country. It's horrendous, and that needs to be changed. Those people are victims of the system. They don't know any better. So do we want to change that, or we want to condemn them to just die of diabetes and cancer and all these things? I don't. So there's where comes this ethical nature of agroecology, where it's not neutral. It takes a view, a social view, an ethical view of the world, and wants to change it. And that's going to lead to huge confrontations, because, as you said, the corporations are here to win. And there's going to be a fight, and there is a fight. There is a big struggle happening, and the world has been like that for centuries, nothing new. So I think that we need to, the idea of the territories is a very interesting idea, because what it does, it allows for peasants to control their territories and do what they want, and then maybe corporations will they already have their territories, and that's not going to change. But at least these territories can be controlled in many ways, because if you are a small farmer and you are, like I was in Belize recently, I just came from there yesterday. It's a disaster. I mean, the small farmers are totally surrounded by big companies spraying with airplanes and so on. I mean, those poor guys have no chance. Whereas if they control a territory, they might be able not to allow, these big planes to come through their properties or things like that. Or you might not allow transgenics to be in your territory or whatever. You can control better the natural resources and the food system that you're going to set up there.
Great. Let's thank Dr. Altieri again. Join us downstairs if you have the time. 376 Grinchard for about the next hour.
Well, that's